Yeah, hi. So in this section, we will discuss about different types of Angular custom services. So to classify on a high level, we can consider Angular has two types of custom services. So we can classify our custom services into two types. So the first type is provider, and the second type is constant. Provider can be simplified in two ways. So first way is by using factory, or by using service. Now this factory can be again simplified into a service called as value. So we can say that Angular gives us completely 5 types of services: provider, constant, factory, service, and value. But to classify on high level, there are only two types of services. One is provider and one is constant. Factory, service, value, these all we can consider as a simplified version of provider. Simplified version of provider is factory or service. Value is a simplified version of the factory. So now let's see an example. So here we had taken a simple application with simple HTML page, and we had constructed one controller. Now let's create a service using provider. So we can create a service using provider by calling a function of provider, which takes two arguments. First is the service name. So let's call this as some book service. And the second argument is a function. And this is our service function, which contains some logic. So let's consider we have some logic of getting the books from the DB. Now we can expose the services using a function called $get. This $get function exposes services or exposes functionalities to the controller. This $get is nothing but a function which returns some object. So the returned object is exposed to our controller. Whenever we inject our services into controller, this returned object is exposed to our controller. So now let's consider we are just exposing some functionality called getBooks, which is a local function called getBooks from DB. So just to avoid confusion, we had taken different name. So this is the local function which we had defined here, and this is the function which we are exposing as a service to our controller. So now let's inject this book service into our controller. Now let's define some scope object of books, and this books we are getting from our service using a function of getBooks. So here we have to observe that we are only exposing a function called getBooks, not the function of getBooks from the DB, because this is a local function. This local function we are exposing as a service. So this books object in the scope we had iterated in our HTML. So now let's run this application. If we run this application, we see that we are getting books from our service, and this service is called provider. This might look little complex because we have to define a function called $get on this object. This object is nothing but our book service object. So all the functionality which we expose as a returned object, will be exposed to our controller. So our controller can access only getBooks, but not this function, this getBooks from P. So this might look little complex. So to simplify this, we can go with a factory. So we had discussed that provider can be simplified in a form of factory or in a form of service. So now let's see how we can simplify using our factory. So we can create a service using factory also by calling a function of factory, which takes two arguments. So let's name this as book service, which is a function which returns some object. So now this object is exposed to our controller. So in the previous case, whatever object is returned by $get function is exposed to controller. But here in this case, whatever object we are returning, it will be exposed to the controller. So now let's return. So now let's take the same functionality and we are returning function called getBooks. So now we are exposing a function called getBooks. So in the factory, we don't need to write the $get function. We will just return some object. So now if we run this, we will get the same object. But this time we are exposing a service as a factory. So factory is nothing but a simplified version of provider, where we don't write any $get, and they will simply return an object. Provider can be simplified in one more way. Provider can be simplified by using service. So we can create a service through service function. The first argument will be the service name, which we will use as the same book service, Second argument is a function. So the difference between factory and a service is factory exposes all the functionality with a returned object, whereas service will expose functionality using this keyword. So if we have any functionality, so we can expose using this keyword. So now this function is exposed to our controller. So now in our controller we can call function of getBooks from TP. So if we run this, we will get the same output. That means we are exposing a service. We are exposing a service using a service function. So the difference between factory and a service is factory will call the factory function. So when we call any function, it will return an object. So while injecting this service into our controller, this object calls this function. That's why this object is returned with this functionality. Whereas in the case of service, this book service object is created using new operator. This book service object is created using new operator. That's why we will get the functionality which is exposed using this keyword. So that's the only difference between factory and service. So in factory, our service calls the factory function, whereas in case of service, it will call the service constructor, or we can say that it will call the service with a new keyword. There is one more type of service called as value. Value is nothing but a simplified version of factory. Value is nothing but a simplified version of factory. So we can create value by using function of value. Let's name this same. And the second argument will be the function which we are returning. It's the functionality which we want to return. Let's say in this case we are returning getBooks. And here we can directly expose our object. And here we can directly expose our object. So here using value service, we are exposing getBooks, where getBooks is a direct array. So we are directly exposing an array of getBooks. So here in our controller, we will just call this getBooks. So it will also give the same output. Sorry, we have to directly expose that object. So we will return with a value. So we can go with a service called value when our factory doesn't have any dependency. When our factory doesn't have any dependencies. So value is a simplified version of factory. So in value we will directly return an object, whereas in factory we will have some functionality. Through this functionality we can interact with backend or some external services. Then we return an object. But in value we will directly return an object. So this is about provider, factory, service and value. Factories and service are nothing but a simplified versions of provider, whereas value is a simplified version of a factory. So in our next section, we will discuss what is a constant, and also we will see why should we go with provider, why should we go with factory, or when should we use provider, when should we go with factory, when should we use service, or when should we use the value.